Hmm? No, it's seems to be work. You jinxed it now.
Oh.
Did I pick the, well, it doesn't matter. I was thinking this was the last one. A little bit about external amplifiers. What is prohibited communications? Some stuff on spread spectrum and auxiliary stations. Um, the Canadian reciprocity and special temporary authority for different protocols and frequencies. So there's FCC rules on what the emission standards are for a power amplifier. You're limited to 1,500 watts or the lesser of its output. And if I recall, spurious emissions have to be, particularly the odd, 43 dB down from the fundamental or the carrier. That changed here recently. I guess sometime before this question pool, but it used to be 35. So it's now 43. If you're selling one, okay, if and it's not FCC certified, in other words, it could have been built or modified by a licensed amateur, that's legal to sell it to a licensed amateur. If it's a commercial one, then it can only be sold to a licensed amateur and it has to meet the certification. Although if you build it yourself, you're still supposed to meet the certification, but I don't know that it's mandatory. Seems kind of fuzzy. Under what circumstances may a dealer sell an external RF power amplifier capable of operation below 144 megahertz if it has not been granted FCC certification? Which of the following best describes one of the standards that must be met by an external RF power amplifier if it is to qualify for a grant of FCC certification? Okay, prohibited communications. There's a bunch of different ones and exceptions for them. You're not allowed to accept any kind of compensation, money or material, unless you're an instructor, teacher, and part of your job, you're getting paid for teaching and transmitting amateur radio. I don't know. I guess there's schools where that happens, but it's kind of a weird exception in there. Otherwise, you're not allowed to, you can trade stuff, but you're not allowed to sell stuff. And when you use amateur radio to send to a business, it has to be just normal message stuff. Can't have anything to do with any money interest or business interest. Um, kind of fairly obvious there. So which of the following types of amateur station communications are prohibited? Alpha. When may an amateur station send a message to a business? Encryption. You're not allowed to encrypt messages except for the case of CW is a form of encryption, but it's open source, so it's a published protocol. One of the exceptions is if you're controlling a space station, which essentially is a satellite, not the space station. You're allowed to send encrypted control messages. The same thing's true for radio control models. That's an encrypted transmission. It's also a one-way transmission. They do allow you to use the Q signals and procedural signals. What do they call them? Something. Pro signs. And you can come up with your own new digital protocol as long as you publicly document all of its characteristics. So like, when Taylor came up with the FT8 and all that kind of stuff, you can do that kind of thing as long as you publish it, and then you can get a temporary approval to actually try it out. What are the restrictions on the use of abbreviations or procedural signals in the amateur service? Bravo. Essentially, you can use anything as long as it doesn't obscure the message and it's not profanity. And what must be done before using a new digital protocol on the air? Charlie. Which of the following cannot be transmitted over an amateur radio mesh network? I think that the mesh is just another red herring because it should apply to any. Spread spectrum. So we're talking Wi-Fi and cell phones and things. So amateur radio currently is limited to 222 megahertz and above for sending spread spectrum. You're limited 10 watts peak effective power. You have to abide by the third-party rules, which we haven't got to yet, but there's no exceptions to them. And you cannot communicate with any non-licensed Wi-Fi station. So if it's Wi-Fi being done by an amateur, you can contact them. If it's not an amateur station, you're prohibited. Not sure why that one's there. And of course, you're not supposed to cause interference with the other ones. We're not. Are we primary on 2 meters and 440?
As far as I know, I haven't heard any different.
And
There might be.
And the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, I assume we are too, but I know it's shared with Uh, Actually, I'm thinking medical is primary on the 2.4, some kind of,
A lot of things.
yeah. What's the maximum PEP output allowed for spread spectrum transmissions? In what part of the 13 centimeter band may an amateur station communicate with non-licensed Wi-Fi stations? Under what circumstances are messages that are sent via digital modes exempt from Part 97 third-party rules that apply to other modes of communications? On what frequencies are spread spectrum transmissions permitted? Oop. Got to double click that time. Held it too long. Auxiliary stations. So a technician, a general, an advanced, or extra can be the control operator of an auxiliary station. They talk about that being a trick question because of the fact that there's still novice people around. So who may be the control operator of an auxiliary station? Oh, now it's doing it. You did jinx me. Canadians operating in the US, we have a reciprocal agreement. So they basically have the privileges of, well, depending on what they're thinking, up to an extra in the US. And I believe it's reciprocal for us in Canada. There's also the A line, which I'm not sure how wide it is. It's a couple hundred miles, I think. But basically, it's the line that goes from Washington State to Maine that runs parallel to the US-Canadian border. And you're not allowed to transmit in the 420 to 430 megahertz frequency range if you're within that area. There's also the equivalent of it on the Canadian side called the B line, which is about the same distance away. So you've got a DMZ zone basically around the border. And it has something to do with military. I don't know exactly what it is. And here they actually give you all the points along there. So amateur stations may not transmit in which of the following frequency segments if they're located in the contiguous 48 states and north of line A? Which of the following geographic descriptions approximately describes line A? Alpha. So I mentioned that Canadian operators have the same privileges here that they do in Canada, not to exceed an extra class. So, and I have no idea what the Canadian classes are. And I believe it's a reciprocal thing with us in Canada, or at least used to be, maybe not today.
Yeah.
This is the way the lawyers write it. So what privileges are authorized in the U.S. to persons holding an amateur service license granted by the government of Canada? Special temporary authority uh, is set up so that you can advance the state of the art in radio communications. So you can request, you have to fill out some forms and request authority to operate some new type of equipment. And of course, they throw in there, must be accompanied by the proper filing fee. Under what circumstances might the FCC issue a special temporary authority to an amateur station? Okay, so we talked about certification for power amplifiers and what to do with non-certified ones, what prohibited communications, basically compensation, business use. There's more prohibited coming up in another one because profanity and things like that also are prohibited. We can only do spread spectrum to 20. Limited to 10 watts PEP. No exceptions for third party. A technician general, advanced, or extra can be a control operator for an auxiliary station. Line A is this imaginary line going from the west coast to the east coast, where you cannot transmit on the 420 to 430 megahertz segment within that area on either side of the border. Canadians have reciprocal privileges in the U.S., and special temporary authority is for doing experimental amateur communications.